He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love having conversations about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry. Today, we have Andy Nairn, who is a senior strategist and a creative with Lucky Generals in London, who's also the author of Go Luck Yourself. We're going to talk to him about that and a lot of other things. Let's join the conversation. Okay. All right, Henry, we're back with another episode, and we are very fortunate to have with us today a gentleman from London whose reputation precedes him. His name is Andy Nairn. Have I said your last name correctly, Andy?
That's very good pronunciation. It's a Scottish name, but I think Americans do it better than people in London because you pronounce your R's, so you did it brilliantly.
Right now, I'm just flustered. I don't know how to follow up on that, but thank you. I'm glad I did that. And I'm just gonna. He's got a book out which we're gonna talk about, but his about the author sums up his career really well. And so for those of our 146 YouTube followers who don't know who he is, let me just introduce you. He said he stumbled into advertising after studying law at Edinburgh University. So he's repented for his sins. He's now in the creative world, thank goodness. Almost 30 years later, he's one of the world's most respected brand strategists and a founder of one of UK's most successful ad agencies. Lucky Generals has been shortlisted for Campaign Magazine's Agency of the Year for 5 years in a row, and Andy has been named the country's top strategist for the last 3 in a row. He also has been listed as one of the top 5 creative people in the world of advertising by Business Insider. And now he has this great book out called Go Luck Yourself. The subtitle is 40 Ways to Stack the Odds in Your Brand's Favor. This is really new. When did it come out, Andy?
It sort of came out last year, and I've been mostly sort of promoting it in the UK. So I'm only just getting around to really promoting it elsewhere now. But
okay,
it's universally relevant because I guess we could all do with a little bit of luck right now.
Yes.
Well, first, let me just say on behalf of Henry, welcome to the Brief Brothers. We're very glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me on. I've enjoyed it in the past, and so it's nice to be on it this time.
Well, that's great. I'm going to start off with kind of I loved your book and I highly recommend it. Let me start off by saying that. But perhaps you've heard a phrase here in the United States called, I have a bone to pick with you.
Go on then.
I have a little contention with your book. I, for one, do not believe in luck.
Right, okay.
To me, it's a superstition.
Okay.
And as I was reading your book and going through it, I kept scratching my head because your premise, which is, brands succeed based on their luck, doesn't quite live up to the points that you've made. And then you quoted Gary Player,
yes,
who said, the more I practice, the luckier I get. Now, what you didn't do, and I haven't read the entire book cover to cover, I've covered many pages and skipped ahead and looked at some of your conclusions. Unless you told that backstory about Gary Player, I think my point is that Gary doesn't believe in luck either.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, the backstory to that little quote from Gary is that he's in his 80s now, so he hasn't been playing for many, many years. But when he was one of the big 3, Jack Nicklaus, Arnold Palmer, and Gary Player were the big 3 in the 60s. When he was back in his heyday, he was at a tournament and he was practicing at a sand shots at a practice green. And a fan was watching him hit these sand shots. And Gary was in his zone, and shot after shot out of the sand, he would go in the hole or go very close to the hole. And every time he did that, the fan would say, oh, that's just luck. Oh, that's just luck. Of course, Gary could hear him saying that, and Gary got a little pissed off. And I heard him tell this story. Mm-hmm. But Gary, being unfailingly polite, turned to the fan and said, you're absolutely right. The more I practice, the luckier I get. Yeah. Which was his way of saying politely, you little asshole, I'm in complete control of my game. That's why I'm as good as I am. Luck had nothing to do with it. So my question is, you talk about brands requiring luck. If I understand luck, to be success or failure based on chance, not on hard work, that's not what you're saying.
No.
I think your conceit is you can make your own luck by doing certain things.
Yeah.
Have I got that right?
The big difference, and actually it was really interesting what you did there, because when you talked about it there, you talked about Gary Player not winning as a result of just luck. And that word just is so important. When we start talking about this guy being just lucky, then that is that's very insulting, isn't it? If you said I was just lucky, I would be a bit cross, and I've written a book about it. I've got an agency called Lucky General. So I'm not saying that people are just lucky. That's not enough. You do have to work hard, and you do have to be talented. But I don't think that luck is the opposite of hard work and talent. I think it's another thing that goes alongside those good qualities. And I think if you go to the opposite extreme, if you say there's no such thing as luck and it's all about hard work, I think that's just manifestly untrue, because we can see that in all aspects of life. Before we even get into advertising, the most successful and richest and wealthiest people in the world are not just the ones who work hard or who work hardest. And if we were to say to someone, without opportunities in life, just work harder, life doesn't play out like that. There are other things involved that we've got to figure out and take into account. So I think you've got to work hard, of course, you've got to be talented. But if we're all being honest, I bet every single person who's watching this, who's had any degree of commercial or creative success, has had a little bit of luck along the way. And I think it's really helpful to embrace that and recognize it. And because if you don't, all sorts of problems occur in the way that you live your life, in the way that you run an agency and create and work. And I can talk more about that if you like.
I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I definitely see where you're going, and I agree. And we don't want to get into a discussion about what the word luck is, but you think about probabilities, right? And so everything has, there's a range of probabilities that could happen. And if we were like taking it in a gambling environment, right, like the guy who plays blackjack, the house has like a 52 to 55% chance of winning each hand. But if you play a certain way, you can alter those probabilities in your favor, and you're not going to win 100% of the time. But if you count cards and things like that, you can alter it so that you could win. So you can win 55% of the time instead of the house, and eventually you come out on top, right? So, but then there is random chance. Like there are things that you have zero control over, that the client that was supposed to sit in and listen to your pitch that day called in sick, and somebody else pinch hit, and you got along great with them, or you didn't get along great with them, or they didn't understand you. All those things are random chance. But I think you got to be ready, willing, and able to take advantage of the opportunity when random chance shines in your favor, smiles in your favor.
That's a great point as well. I think there's a great quote. I think it was by Louis Pasteur. It might be one of these ones that lots of people claim responsibility for, but I think he defined luck as where opportunity meets a prepared mind, which is kind of what you just said there. So if you take your example, something happens with the client, they change their minds, they cut the budget, let's say, then that is bad luck. But if you've got a prepared mind, you can actually consciously think about that potentially being bad luck and work out to yourself, how can I make that really good luck? And actually, as probably lots of your viewers will know, sometimes a low budget can be a really good way to make you more creative, because it forces you to do something different. So this is all about being, like a lot of things in life, if you just deny that anything exists, it's hard to change it. If you do accept that actually luck does exist in life, and therefore I'm going to try and consciously, like you say, sort of stack the odds in my favor and kind of game the system a little bit and make the most of my luck, then you're much more likely to change it and to spot those opportunities when they come knocking on your door.
And I think that's the wonderful conceit of your book, Andy. I mean, I may disagree with your notion of luck, and that's fine, because we're not going to. I don't want to debate the semantics either, because as I was reading your book, what I noticed and which was caused me to scratch my head is like every prescription that you had, and you got these at the end of each chapter. You have three lines. You have three sentences. Conventional wisdom, luck says, and then so ask yourself for each of your chapters. And as I was looking through this, I realized this is about taking an action. You're not letting chance drive things. No. You know, I was thinking about the line from Walter Russell, who said, mediocrity is self-inflicted, genius
Okay.
is self-bestowed. Have you
Oh,
heard that?
amazing. Yeah, it's good. I hadn't
Yeah,
heard that. I like it.
it's perfect to what you're saying, and that's really what I like about your book. You know,
Good.
for example, Henry says quite often, and I love it, that every brand should have on its staff a full-time brand historian,
Oh, yeah.
someone who knows the depths and the history and the evolution of the brand. I tell a story of going to do a workshop on my creative brief writing at a high-tech company in San Francisco. I can't name them because I work for a company that sends me out to do this. But 20 years earlier, I had freelanced at Ogilvy, LA on this account.
Wow.
And it was an award-winning campaign for this company. When I went to do the training and I mentioned to the people in the room that I had done this campaign, no one had ever heard of it.
Amazing. Amazing.
No one there had worked at the company for more than 5 years. And I'm talking about a campaign that had run 20 years earlier. So when Henry says every brand should have a brand historian, this is about reminding everyone of the assets that you were talking about in your book that are right there in front of you.
Yeah. They're like,
for you to take advantage of. But if you don't know they exist, how can you
the new blood reinventing the wheel? I find that there's just in general not a lot of institutional memory in any institution, which creates basically reinventing the wheel every 4 or 5 years, stumbling on the same barriers, doing the same research, discovering the same insights, finding out that people still hate the same things about your brand or love the same things about your brand. It's just so repetitive to me, and it's frankly not necessary. I mean, if you had one person who was a trained marketer and could act as this brand archivist or historian, they could sit down with the marketers, and it would be a marketer who would say, well, they tried to position the brand this way, this is how it worked, this was very successful, this didn't succeed. And then that stuff, when the brand historian left, it would all be archived, so there'd be a new brand historian who could learn it relatively quickly and become that expert. It's not that hard, I don't think, and it would probably save clients in the long run a ton of money. But
yeah, well, that's the first part of the book is about just appreciating what you got. And again, it's based in science and it's a truth in life. You know, there's lots of evidence that says if we take a moment to appreciate how lucky we are with the benefits in our, the various things going on in our lives, that is the same for client companies. And a lot of the time, it's not even just that nobody knows about the brand history, it's that they actively avoid it, isn't it? Because, a lot of companies feel like if we start thinking about the brand history, if we have an archivist, that will make us look old-fashioned and we'll be looking backwards. But really anyone who's worked on a brand before knows that you got to know what came before to do, and often that that points the way forward, doesn't it? And it's not to say that we end up doing an old-fashioned ad campaign where everyone's wearing Victorian clothing, but you can capture the spirit and the DNA, and then of course you repurpose it to for today's times. And I feel like there are so many aspects of that. And it's almost like, I use the analogy in my book that a lot of the time as an external party, like an advertising agency or consultant, we're sort of going into these brands' houses and we're climbing up into the attic and we're bringing down an artifact. We're just finding what's there right in front of them. And we're maybe just blowing some dust off it or turning it around the other way or just saying, hey, do you remember this thing? And just reminding them of what is already there and actually reminding them how lucky they are to have it, because there's often this kind of aversion to brand characters is another one, isn't it? A lot of companies moan that they've got these kind of annoying icons or brand characters that are old-fashioned and not cool anymore, but a lot of the time the answer is to they're still brilliant and you're lucky to have one of them. You just need to repurpose it and do something modern with it. Don't chuck it away.
Here in the States, Leo Burnett created a ton of those brand characters, right? Like Tony the Tiger, like a lot of them, and their staying power, speaks to, even if they go off the air, people will remember those characters for long
and the
after.
jingles. The jingles too.
We've talked here with Paul Feldwick about, making a brand famous and entertaining. And we talk a lot about mental availability and Byron Sharp's work. What more mental availability can you have in a kid's head than Tony the Tiger, for Frosted Flakes? To me, the idea I think we do a lot in our business because we're embarrassed.
Yeah.
We try to avoid things that embarrass us instead of saying, you know what, it's okay to sell, cereal to kids, and it's okay to use an animated cartoon tiger or whatever the brand character is. So
Yeah.
I personally am less about not being embarrassed and more about like, how do we blow the doors off this thing and sell it?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger in it there. We are here to sell, and we can, as Paul Feldot could say, we should also entertain. That's a great way to, to do it. But it's sort of, don't look down your nose on these amazing assets that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, that are just sitting right under your nose. And it just, again, I think that requires you to be conscious, to wake up in the morning and think, no, do you know what, we are lucky to work at whatever your company is, because we've got this amazing thing. Data being another example. Companies gather huge amounts of data but don't realize that is a gold mine. They spend all that money collecting it, and then it sits in a warehouse doing nothing. They don't do anything with it. Well, that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, 20 some odd years ago, in the mid 90s, my arithmetic is still any good. Is that 20 years ago? In the mid 90s, when I worked at Team One Advertising in El Segundo, we were just launching the Lexus website. That's about the time when a lot of companies were finally getting something up on the internet. And one of the things, I worked in the direct marketing department. The first thing we discovered was that Lexus, through Toyota, had a database of 500,000 names of the people who leased or financed the purchases. And that database of 500,000 names was sitting there doing nothing, collecting dust, as you said. So one of the things that I did with my creative partners in the department I worked in was we put together our first lease retention program for Lexus. So that was a way of taking assets and well, monetizing them, right?
Yeah.
One of the other things that Paul Feldot focused on in his book was the anatomy of humbug.
Yeah.
We talked about it when he was our guest, was not just entertainment, but also, do we even know a history of the philosophies of advertising that have come and gone over the decades? And that failure of knowledge hurts us as marketers and advertising, because we don't have any context. I see this all the time when I'm doing workshops, and marketers are sitting in judgment of the work from the creative departments, but they have never examined what their competitors are doing in terms of the creative work. They haven't looked at the category, or even outside the category. Their tendency, and Henry can speak to this as well, is to react to the work based on what they like, not what they know.
Yeah, it's a good distinction.
So there's this general lack of knowledge, which now leads me to ask you, what was it? I mean, again, I love this book, in spite of my contention with your title. What got you started? What motivated you to write the book?
Well, it's one of these funny things. If you remind ourselves, 2 years ago, the beginning of lockdown over here, I rather foolishly, it shows I'm not much of a planner, actually. I sort of predicted that I didn't think it was going to last very long, for starters. Certainly didn't think it was going to last this long. And also I thought I might have some spare time on my hands, and that was going to be, sitting at home, twiddling my thumbs, and so I don't like to be idle. So I sort of had this idea, and I took it to a publisher, and they really liked it. So by the time I realized that this was going to be quite a long run thing, and also that I was going to be really busy, because we've all been really busy, right? It was too late. I'd already agreed to do it, and agreed to giving all the royalties to a really good cause. It's an organization that helps working class kids get a lucky break. So that was the premise of it. It's here. Why don't I write? I've had a lot of luck, I think, in my life. I've got an agent called Lucky Generals. It seems to be this taboo topic that nobody ever talks about, but I feel like it does play a part in all the big stories, and is big in culture. So maybe I could write a book about luck that brings a bit of luck to other people. And actually, what you were saying there, I thought was really interesting. The textbooks don't. One of the things the textbooks don't do is when they do tell a story, they do a very airbrushed version of it, don't they? I mean, we've all done it. I'm sure I've done it. You've done it. We've all written case studies where everything works perfectly, and that becomes the history of that particular campaign. And of course, the truth is that all sorts of things go wrong, and you do stumble over things, and you have a bit of luck. And I think it's more helpful to acknowledge that, because then you can learn from it in future. And you can perhaps make those stumbles more likely to happen, because again, there are some behaviors that are more likely to artificially make the serendipity happen. You don't have to sit back. You're absolutely right. This is not about sitting back and waiting for luck to come to you. You can, once you know what those stumbles are, you can artificially create the stumbles that will make the luck more likely to happen.
That's the essence of the creative process. When you understand how the creative process works, you put that to your benefit, you employ it, you polish it, you hone it, which is what Gary Player meant when he said he's practicing. That's why he can sink sand shots while the rest of us can barely get out of the sand. Are you familiar with a podcast over here called Tagline?
I am vaguely, but go and remind me of how.
It's Muse by Cleo.
Oh yeah,
yes.
yeah, got it.
This morning I was listening to their newest episode, which is on the history or the backstory of the It's a Tide ad from the 2018 Super Bowl. Yeah. And one of the things that Henry and I insist on doing when we have an episode where we're not interviewing a luminary such as yourself, and we talk about the nuts and bolts of the brief, then we also do a creative review. And Henry and I really try to focus on everyday products, real products that people buy. So when they had the episode this week on Tide, which is a ubiquitous detergent, #1, the category leader, but it's nothing sexy about Tide. It's a detergent. But that campaign turned everything on its head, because the creatives really focused on what it is that they do best. They had to improve on the previous campaign, which was a year or two before, when it was Terry Bradshaw had the stain in his shirt.
Yeah.
And that became a huge success on social media. So all the P&G came back and said, do it again. Own the Super Bowl, do it again. So they were saying, and they interviewed the writers and the creative directors and the marketers. They're saying that was both intimidating and liberating at the same time. But that to me is an example of what you're talking about. This is actually a how-to book.
Oh, really. Very much so. Yeah. No, I hear theory.
I was going to mention the Tagline podcast as well, because I was thinking about this whole idea of luck. And if you listen to those podcasts and they go back and talk about like the history of some of these iconic campaigns, almost all of them, as they tell the story, it becomes obvious that there had to be strokes of great luck. Like the one in particular that stands out to me right now is that we've had a long running radio campaign for Motel 6 here in the United States. It's a budget motel that you go to, but it has a voice, a narrator named Tom Bodett, who's a humorist, and then this music with a fiddle behind it. And that's been the campaign for 30, 40 years. But it was by chance that the copywriter heard this guy on the radio commenting on a radio station, on an NPR radio station, and he really liked his down-home humor. And he kind of filed it away. He contacted the humorist and he said, would you ever consider doing commercial work? And the guy's like, well, maybe, depends. And he just filed it away. And then sometime later, this opportunity to pitch for this motel business came up. And if he hadn't been in the car that day, by the way, his radio in the pickup truck that he drove only could tune to one station. So if his radio had worked, maybe he wouldn't have heard Tom Bodett, and we wouldn't have like one of the most awarded radio commercial campaigns of all time in the United States. So there is luck.
There is, and I mean, if you want to talk Super Bowl commercials, we've done 4 Super Bowl campaigns now for Amazon. But if I go all the way back to the very first one, which I guess might have been about 2018 or something like that. We had this brief from Amazon. How do we, Alexa was in this tech war. Now it looks easy because I guess it is the sort of pretty much the dominant leader. But there was a bit more competition back then. Would Google win? Would Apple win? Microsoft were in there. There was a lot of other players. And how would we make Alexa, sort of feel human and sort of, a brand that you loved, not just that, that you respected and thought would work. It's got to be some sort of emotion there. And then we were thinking about that, and my creative partner, Danny, was chatting to a non-creative guy, like an operations guy called Nick, and they were just chatting about all sorts of stuff. And Nick started talking about he'd been watching a Disney film with his kids. It was The Little Mermaid, you know, the Hans Christian Andersen story where the mermaid loses her voice. And he was sort of saying, oh, wouldn't it be funny if Alexa lost her voice? And now a lot of creative people might have just ignored that. What does this operations guy know? Who cares? And also it's a kids movie and it sounds a bit dumb. And also really big also, we're not going to spend all that money in the Super Bowl ad showing a product not working and, you know, being broken. You know, that's probably not going to go down very well. But to Danny's great credit, and then to the client's great credit, they realized that, you know, that might be a really lovely way to show a bit of, you know, vulnerability and humanity, and not present ourselves as this huge big corporation, but actually, you know, somebody that could have a laugh at themselves. And even Jeff Bezos, you know, you may remember, was in the ad, you know, sort of wondering how this was possible. And we got all these celebs to try and do a good job instead. Anyway, all of that lovely stuff, you know, it goes back to this idea of there was a little bit of a lucky moment, but it required a prepared mind to kind of to pick that up and realize how powerful that could be.
He had called in sick that day.
Yeah. Okay. You're not going to change my minds. I still don't believe in luck. Okay.
You're just not budging.
Nope. I'm going to come right out. I'm going to come out and I'm going to say I'm a person of faith and I believe it. If I were to retitle this book and see, go bless yourself, but that wouldn't sell many books.
No,
I understand
right.
that.
Lose my
Our crowd is the secular humanist who's the hip woke urbanist. Go bless yourself isn't going to sell many books. So I get that. Yes. Nevertheless, let me just compliment you, Andy, by saying that spot that you talked about for Alexa loses her voice, I use that in my workshop as a practice exercise for writing a single-minded proposition. I say this is a softball. You guys should be able to figure this out. You'd be amazed how many people stumble trying to figure out what's the one thing we're trying to do here. Because it's so straightforward. People overthink.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, you know, I think overthinking is a curse.
A disease in our disease.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Because ultimately, consumers don't overthink. They've got, like, you know, a split second to make most of the decisions, or if that, it's probably unconscious most of the time. So
yeah, that mismatch between how much we obsess about our brands and the brands we work on is with what consumers actually, the real estate they actually devote to brands in their mind. It's incredible, that mismatch. And I think that leads to ultimately a lot of dull advertising, because you're analyzing every single thing, and so it's being homogenized and so forth, and it's usually not good. I think you need to understand going in that people don't give a crap about your brand, as Bob Hoffman would say, and that makes you more daring in trying to get their attention.
Yeah, definitely.
Just a couple episodes ago, we interviewed an old friend of mine who worked at Campbell Mithun in Minneapolis and Martin Williams, and we worked together on a campaign for H&R Block, in the early mid 2000s, and we lost the campaign to, I think it was DDB Chicago eventually, and Henry. I remember Henry rolling his eyes when it was revealed that the campaign idea, "You Got People," was shot down because someone's mother thought it was grammatically incorrect. A campaign that was doing double-digit sales was killed.
Yeah. I heard that episode. I heard that episode. It was recent, and I thought it was crazy, wasn't it? You know, and we think of all the great campaigns, like, you know, Got Milk, I think had suffered from similar. You know, somebody, I think, piped up in that process and says, that doesn't really, it should be, have you got milk, or do we have it? You know, no, that's not how these things work.
Yeah, same, you know, with think different.
Yeah, think different. Yeah, that's right. It's an adverb, as you said. I remember you saying this now. Yeah, it should be think differently.
I objected, but, you know, I've calmed down on at least some things. Not luck, but on some things. So the response to your book has been, I take it, good.
Yeah, it's been really great, actually, because I think it just people. I mean, I have struck a little bit lucky because, of course, that to publish it in a time when we're all feeling so unlucky, it's you know, people are maybe prepared to give this a bit of a chance, because, you know, we might as well try something. So I think there's a little bit of that. The agency is doing really well at the moment, so we've got lots of lovely case studies. I try to use lots of things. I don't want it to be like a creds document for the agency. There's lots of different things from culture, but I think just a lot of the big issues in culture at the moment, whether it's the bad luck of the pandemic, but also things like privilege and sort of some stuff that's going on in society right now that is kind of making various groups of people think how lucky they are actually, makes it socially interesting as well as creatively interesting. And also I feel like it should be fun. The creative process, I think we all work better when we're fun and having fun and can play, and that's why I sort of I do sort of disagree with this mantra that it's only about hard work, because we all know that if we walk around the block and we're inspired by nature, or we go to church and we're inspired by religion or this sport or whatever the thing is that is outside of our work that we then bring back, it's like you say, you store it away in your memory, and somehow years later sometimes, or months later, it becomes useful. I think all those things are things that we need to remind ourselves of, and not come out of this pandemic telling ourselves just to sort of slave away. So it seems to be chiming lots of good chords with people.
I have a quick question. You mentioned that that at the beginning of the pandemic, you didn't think it would last for long. I'm curious of what your basis for thinking that was, and because I felt the same way, and I could tell you after what my basis of thinking it was.
I guess it's just proof that when we're not used to it was that word unprecedented that everybody started using in unprecedented fashion. The word unprecedented was unprecedented, wasn't it? And I guess I just couldn't conceive of anything. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we had we had a sort of a phone brief, a handset brief by a company called OnePlus, and they're based in Wuhan. And the account handler was kind of saying, yeah, that's probably not going to happen because they've got this problem back in this city that perhaps none of us had really heard of. And some funny thing is happening there that is really messing up their supply chains. And we were all like saying, how bad can this thing be? What's it happening? And then of course, within a few weeks, we realized, oh, it's that thing. And it's coming our way. But all of this just seems so strange and alien to us, didn't it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I just from literally day one of the lockdown, I started questioning the whole thing. In terms of understanding, my background was in economics, and understanding that when you shut down complex systems like the interdependent world economy, that there was going to be costs at some place at some time that we're not accounting for right now. Like we're only have our eyes on this virus and how the virus spreads and how many people does it spread to and how deadly is it or whatever. So we're going to do this other thing without even contemplating, well, what are the possible ramifications of doing this other thing that we're going to do. And I just didn't ever believe that societies would tolerate those incredible costs, and we have, for a lot longer than what I thought. But that's neither here nor there, I guess, at this point.
Well, Andy, let's pivot, and I want to ask you about the creative brief, because Henry and I love to talk about the brief. And you are a planner. You're also a creative. So it's like you are the best of me and the best of Henry. Although that's probably elevating me.
Certainly elevating me. I would.
Well, maybe if you took the best of me and the best of Henry, we'd come close to recreating Andy Nairn.
Well, I'm sure I'm nowhere near that, but
what are some of the things that you bring? Or let me start more fundamentally. You've been in the business for a while. The brief is a fundamental part of what you do. How has your attitude or approach to the brief changed over the years?
Oh, that's good. Well, I sort of increasingly know, I try not to worry about it so much. I think one of the problems when you're a young strategist is that you really worry about the words. And obviously to some degree, I mean, it's a really important document, right? And it's going to, getting it right is important. But sometimes I think people obsess literally about the written document as opposed to the broader conversation. That's one thing. And sometimes they also obsess and feel that they should take the entire burden on their own shoulders, and that it's the classic, the strategist has to go away and burrow away and use their cleverness to come up with something really clever, probably overthink it, and then come back and almost sell it to the creative, and as the only way to do this, and sort of force it on them, and almost treat it as a contract as well. I think that's often a mistake, is to say, I've done all this work, this is the only way to do it, you must now execute that. And again, to return to my theme, I feel like a lot of the time what that is used to do is to say, let's leave nothing to chance, let's take luck out of this equation, and you can almost predict what the answer is that comes out of, when the creatives come back. But I always find it's really disappointing when a creative come back with literally what I could have imagined anyway, writing the brief, because otherwise, like, why have I got a creative on this? I could just do all of this myself. So I feel like what I've learned is have a conversation with creatives, make it, it's not just all about the strategist, or have a chat with the account team or whoever, lots of people can have a conversation before you write the brief, and then don't obsess so much on the, some of the minutiae of, the classic thing that people do is try to write an end line or tagline for, for their proposition and make something so clever and brilliant. But in doing that, sometimes they try a little wordplay or a trick of language that is very limiting, because that's then the only way that you can execute it is to repeat that trick of language. And sometimes it's better to just keep it dead simple and say, this is the one thing we're trying to get across, and there's lots of different ways in, but use your imagination. And actually, frankly, if you end up in somewhere different, I feel that's also legitimate if it's a better place. If you end up in a much better place than one.
We've talked about that a lot. I 100% agree with you. To me, it's not a contract between me and the creatives. It's kind of like a bare bones roadmap that says, hey, there's gold over there if you kind of head in that direction, and here's some very basic directions of how to get there, I think. But if they find gold along the way and taking another route, I have to be humble enough to say, hey, this was, and I have live examples that, I said, hey guys, this is a great insight, a bigger insight than what I had uncovered. Let's go back and let's everybody look at it through this lens that a creative team brought to me. So I'm with that. I try to teach the people that I've mentored in strategy to be humble. You can't be the one that's sitting there, well, that's not what the brief says.
That's exactly it. It's a team effort, and I really like that treasure example. If you find the gold, if you find more gold over there, then you'd be foolish to say, no, we mustn't pick up that treasure even though there's more of it. That would be crazy. But that is how a lot of people function, isn't it?
Are you at a place, Andy, where you feel that you follow a similar procedure when you start to write a brief, or you just kind of feel your way into the project and don't adhere to a specific process, or maybe a little bit of both?
I would say I'm more on the loose side. So we're perhaps unusual. We don't have a briefing format, which I guess.
You don't have a template? You don't have a set template?
No template. I mean, having said that, if you looked at the briefs that we write, they're all going to cover, I'm sure, very similar information to anyone else. But what I've found is that every agency I've ever worked at, whenever there's a new, head of strategy, they say, let's change the briefing template, but then end up changing one word, or 2 words, but it's really all the same information is required. And I just find sometimes that's what I mean about what I've learned over the years, that the document is only a means to an end. And it's a starting point of the conversation. It might even be a document that captures a conversation you've already had with the creatives, and it's just formalizing it. And so, there are different ways to tell a story or to have that conversation. I wouldn't begin a conversation with someone always in the same formulaic way. So it sort of really depends on, I like to write them depending on what this brief is and what's the best way to communicate this challenge to, ideally, if I know who the person is, I might even write it slightly differently depending on which team I'm giving it to, because some people like loads of facts and sheets of attachments, and some creators don't, right?
Yeah, a lot of creators will just say, all I want to see is the, whatever you call it, the single-minded proposition, the one key thing, whatever you call it on your brief. And I've seen 20 different ways of saying the same thing. That's all I want to see. And some creatives say, if you have an insight, tell me the insight. Now, I've seen creative brief templates that don't even ask the question, what is the insight? but insights and interesting tidbits, which I think Henry prefers to say interesting things,
Yeah,
which to me is, I think, more appropriate, because insight is a
I agree.
packed word, an
Yeah.
overpacked word. But I've seen,
Overpromise.
yeah,
I think a
overpromise.
lot of times. I mean, we were talking about the Hulu example that we did in our like 3-part series, and to me, the insight in that one that I chose, and there was a few things, you know, we could have talked about the paradox of choice, right? Like when you have too many choices.
Yeah.
But ultimately, what I put down was that because it's the question that the way I have it in my brief is, what's the most interesting thing about the buyers, the category, or the brand? So it gives us
Yeah.
3 different areas where we could pick one thing that we find the most interesting. And to me, it was that streamers aren't monogamous, right? We don't have to sell them to be their sole source of entertainment and streaming and information. We just have to be in that consideration set. We got to, if we're going to go back to the golf analogy, we got to get close to the cup. We don't have to sink it. And so that idea that they're not monogamous, I think, is not only true, it's a true thing. I think it's interesting, and I think it's also fertile, because you could start sparking ideas on like, well, what does it mean like when I'm buying a streaming service to complement other streaming services that I already have?
Yeah.
And what does that look like, as opposed to just trying to sell my product in isolation as like, we're the best,
Yeah.
we're the one you need to have.
Yeah. I tell you, one of the best things I have learned along the way, my little top tips I often give strategists, is to do your written brief, but also see if you can capture it into pictures, because sometimes forcing yourself to do 2 very distinctive pictures that speak for themselves without any further explanation can be like a really sharp way to, it gets you out of writing little word plays that sort of fudge things, and could be, you know, people write propositions with a clever turn of phrase that might be able to cover about 4 different things, and then, but they haven't really nailed what the thing is. And I first tried this out in a anti-smoking brief for the government, and cutting through all the, you know, cutting to the chase. I did the brief with 2 boards. One was a picture of blackened lungs, you know, those classic, disgusting, horrible medical photographs that the government had been using for 30 or 40 years in this country. And I kind of sort of said, this stuff, these blackened lungs, don't work, because by definition, all smokers know about this now and have known about it for many, many years, and it's on every single packet of cigarettes, so they see it 20 times a day, sort of thing. So that cannot be working. So that's that. And the reason it's not working is people say, it's my body, it's my choice, I can do whatever I like, and also it might not kill me for 20, 30 years, and I'm 21 years old, so who cares? Anyway, so picture of blackened lungs, and then I had a picture of a crying child, because what I'd found in research was that people were much more motivated by the anguish they were causing their kids than the physical harm they were doing themselves. Because with their kids, you know, that thing about it being my body doesn't apply. You know, I can do whatever I like to my own body, but I don't like the idea of upsetting my child. And the excuse that it was going to happen 20 or 30 years time didn't apply either. It was kind of my kids crying tonight, and I heard them last night, and I got lots of people in the focus groups had been saying, you know, that my kids put, you know, messages in my cigarette packets, or have asked me to stop smoking. So the brief really was, there was lots of, you know, written stuff to go alongside it, but the brief was a picture of some disgusting lungs and a picture of a tearful child, and everybody got the brief straight away without me really having to say a word. And ever since that, I found that's a good test, because if you can't do that, it probably suggests that there's not a distinctive shift from, you know, you're either sort of saying everybody used to do this, or we used to do this, and now we're going to do that, or everybody else does that and we're going to do this. And if you can't make that very distinctive through pictures, then maybe the brief isn't clear or sharp or interesting enough.
I love that. You know, one of my favorite brief templates, and Henry and I have talked about this, has two questions. They're connected, and you've probably seen this and used it yourself. One says, what do they think now? What does the audience, what does our customer think now, or feel now, or believe now about the product, the category, the situation, the problem? And then once they've seen our campaign or our ad or whatever, what do we want them to think or feel or do? And it's that tension that you're talking about. As a creative or a former creative, I haven't practiced in a while. I just teach. Take out the word just. I teach.
Yeah, exactly.
I respond to that visual challenge
Yeah.
because as a copywriter, I often tried to solve the problems of my briefs visually. If I could get away with a solution that had no words, I thought I'd nail it, because then that's universal. It's like IKEA's instructions for assembling their Billy bookshelves.
Yeah,
right.
that's right.
It's good for every language.
Yeah.
It shows you, it doesn't tell you. So if you can come up with a creative idea or solution that requires no words, that's powerful. And your brief, I think that's a great tip. This is, I don't know what minute point this is in this conversation, but we're going to point that out when we announce this episode, because that's a great tip. I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's practical as well.
I was saying before that often the really best briefs that I've seen, and I don't teach from case studies. I use actual briefs, which by their very nature are not perfect. They're often very good. They're inspiring. They're short, but they're not perfect. And I love the idea of saying, this is a great brief, but let's pick it apart.
Yeah.
Let's find out what's good. What could we have done better? What's missing? And the brief about that I used from the Richards group for Kiwi shoe polish never asks the question, what is the insight? Never even asks any question related to that. What's interesting? But it's packed, the answers on this brief, and there are 127 words. I know because I've counted them. Every answer has an insight in it about the audience they're trying to talk to, which means that the strategist or the planner, whoever wrote the brief, spent an awful lot of time thinking about this. Whether he or she talked with the creatives, I can't say because I don't know the backstory. And the brief is probably 20 years old. But the brief itself, I think, is really good. So this leads me to my next question. Is there a part of the brief, a question on the brief, even though you don't have a standard template, that you save for last, or that you always find the most difficult, maybe a little intimidating, or maybe you get excited about it because it's a challenge?
Do you know what? This might be answering a slightly different question, but I often write briefs backwards. I think this is another problem that people sometimes, especially when you've got a template, people sometimes fill in the form in the physical order that it's written. But I think you need to start with the difficult bit. So spend all the time thinking about the difficult bit and then write it backwards from that, so that everything before the big unveil of the brief is leading inexorably towards that point, and then everything afterwards is leading out to give you lots of different ways in, and nothing else should be in there that doesn't sort of turn on that sort of fulcrum sort of thing. So I think what I often find is really helpful is either a really clear and vivid description of the problem. I think creatives often, if you can just tell me what the problem is really clearly, then that's often a really good thing for creatives, or the brand's mission as well. And if you can define that in a really vivid way, then that's often quite a helpful sort of turning point, and then just construct the brief all around that.
I like that.
I find that I'm similar to you in that sense, that I usually have an idea of where I'm going to go with a brief, like in terms of a proposition or an insight. But since it's an organic and iterative process, often you go back and there's a little bit of a negotiation there, and you start saying, well, is this really that? And then you start, and it kind of makes you pause and think. So I keep repeating it, is organic and iterative, right? It's not just fill it out one time and you do it, like you said, linear from top to bottom. It's like, no, I have this idea for a single-minded proposition, and then I'm going to write the target description so that it kind of, the correct answer is that single-minded proposition. But as I'm writing that target description, I remember something, or something comes to mind, and that could affect the wording that I use in that single-minded proposition. So I think my advice to young brief writers is to not lock in on anything, keep everything variable. But when you change a variable, go back and check the others, because then you're going to want to make sure, because to keep the brief neat and tidy and not over bloated, you're going to only want to keep the stuff in that kind of drives it forward. That there could be a bunch of interesting facts that don't really drive your proposition or your insight. Well, why am I going to include that in there if it's not really supporting, if it's not a base for supporting what we're trying to claim is the most important thing we're supposed to be saying?
Exactly.
And also another thing that we've said on the podcast, or I believe this to be true, is that the single-minded proposition in a brief is more of a MacGuffin than anything else. Like in the movies, the MacGuffin is the thing that everybody chases, the Maltese Falcon, it doesn't matter what the object is. So yeah, we spend a lot of time kind of wordsmithing this thing, but it's really about the conversation that gets us there, to your point. Like we're having a briefing and it's like, they might discard the single-minded proposition immediately, but they don't discard the rest of the context and things that we learned about the target. So in my mind, it's just a way of organizing your thinking, and so that you can tell a story.
Definitely. And then, as I'm sure Howard will have sort of worked in briefs like this, where the proposition becomes, it's a really good springboard, but it almost, you never say it, it becomes the takeout. It's there's often a difference between, am I actually saying this thing, or am I letting people deduce it and take it out of the advertising from themselves, sort of thing. And again, that's kind of fine. We just have to allow ourselves a little bit of wiggle room to figure out what the best answer to that is.
Yeah, we talk about completing the circle a lot with the advertising, right? Like let the
draw
consumer,
the circle, but don't complete it. Yeah.
So the consumer can deduce what you're trying to tell them without like just banging it over their heads a million times.
Which is called the Sledgehammer school of advertising. We don't trust you to figure it out. We're going to tell you.
I tell clients that you could drive a nail into a wall with the heel of a shoe if you hit it enough times, right? But with a good hammer, you hit it one time and you've done the job. And that's to me the benefit of creativity, is embed that message in a consumer's mind without them having to do a lot of work and without you having to do a lot of work.
Yeah. Sure. I want to go back to something you'd said before, Andy, which was really interesting, because it's about, creatives often stumble or get hung up on, tell me what the problem is so that I can solve it. It's very infrequent that when I do my creative brief workshop training that I work with advertising folks at agencies. I mean, I'm working with marketers who don't have the benefit of someone like you or Henry on staff, no planner, no strategist. So doing that work of getting together and writing a brief often falls on the shoulders of a marketer who has a bazillion other things to do besides write a brief. Whereas you and Henry, you may not write briefs every day. You're doing things that are around the briefing process. A marketer isn't. So we talk about collaboration. But the problem that we sometimes face is we can't get an agreement on what the problem is. And when you can't get an agreement on what the problem is, you can't write the brief. So what I sometimes say is, let's break that down and ask the question, are we trying to solve a problem or are we responding to an opportunity? And I wanted to know, do you see it as a dichotomy like that, or do they kind of blend in together?
I think they sort of blend in together, don't they? They're often, I think some of the best briefs, and there's a whole section in the book about this, is where a problem turns out to be an opportunity. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of energy in that. Things that appear like, again, to use the language that I've been using, like bad luck, often turn out to be good luck. It's a blessing in disguise. It's the classic burn back, find a flaw in your product, and then if you can turn that into a good thing, think small for Volkswagen. No, I'm going to tell you why small is actually a great thing. Or my favorite, which I'm not sure if you're so familiar with in the States, is Guinness. Good things come to those who wait. The most annoying thing about drinking a pint of Guinness is it takes ages to pour, but and so you'd think in conventional marketing terms, don't go anywhere near that. It's a terrible thing to talk about. But to be able to say, no, that's all about anticipation is a fantastic.
Heinz Ketchup actually had a campaign like that. And Anticipation was a Carly Simon song.
Huge success. Success.
Absolutely. The other Bernbach one is like, bagels are only for Jewish people. Well, let's turn that on its side and show an American.
Well, even the Tide ad. It's it's a Tide ad. Everything that they did before that was about getting the stain out. So the 2018 campaign was, if they've got clean clothes, it must be because they use Tide. So there were no stains anywhere. That they turned their own premise on its head, and that's what gave them the great campaign.
So one of the things I do in the brief, actually, this is another little practical tip, is I try to find out what all the bad stuff is, because it's human nature. We gravitate, you know, when we're asking the clients, the marketers, to tell us about the product, we usually say, and you know, and what's its selling point, or what's its advantages, or what's its benefits, and why have you got any things that you do better than the competition? And you know, we naturally gravitate towards positive. Great. But sometimes finding out what are the negatives and the problems and the flaws, and you know, can I see your customer complaints, or what the thing that I do is I try and find out what the jokes are that people make about the brand. Now, if the brand isn't well known, people are not making jokes about it. But if it's a well-known brand, I go on to, you know, Google Images, and I'll put the brand name in, and then, you know, Google for cartoons, or I'll look in Twitter, because what is at the heart of a joke is that there's got to be a truth there, right? And
Right.
if people, you know, comedians' jokes don't work unless there's a truth there. So if they're making jokes about how expensive your product is, or the kind of people that use it, that's what people are laughing about when you're not in the room. And I figure you're better you might as well know that people are laughing about you when you're not in the room, and maybe you can anticipate that and make the joke yourself, but better, you know, or address it. And you know, that again, that's what good salespeople do, don't they? They know what you're thinking, so they're going to head it off at the pass and disarm you with a really nice way to
It's an interesting twist to what Steve Jobs used to say, that, you know, it's what matters is what people are saying about your brand when you're not listening, or when you're not in the room.
Yeah, that's right.
But now it's about what jokes are they making, and how do you take advantage of that? Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about.
And it's easier than ever to find those things. Like you said, you just pop in like your brand name and the word meme afterwards, and it's going to come up with every meme that's ever been written about your brand, if it's a big brand.
And actually, maybe just to tie that back to the previous thing, there's a great example of this it's from a few years ago now, but it's from Fallon in the UK, and it was for a car brand called Skoda, which Czechoslovakian, you know, after the Soviet Union and all the rest of it. So it had a terrible reputation, and they were a joke, you know, the ridiculous sort of Soviet era sort of car brand over here. Then they were bought by Volkswagen, so the cars turned out to be really good, because they were effectively exactly the same chassis as a VW. But they still had this badge on that was, you know, that was Skoda and was a joke. And they were all sitting around the table trying to define the problem. And like you say, they don't always agree. Quite a lot of the people, the engineers, were all saying, we just need to let people know how good the engineering is. We just need to let people know that VW is behind us. And then one person at the end of the table said, very quietly, just muttered, I've got children crying in my showroom. And what he meant by that was, sometimes the dad or the mom is about to buy a Skoda, and the kid is upset because he's going to get teased at school because it's Skoda. And that was a brilliant, and that became the beginning of that brief, was that our children crying in showrooms. We got to acknowledge the fact that there was a joke, and all the advertising from that point on sort of acknowledged the joke, but then brilliantly, because if you can acknowledge a joke about yourself, then that's confident, right? And they disarm.
You can disarm it. Yeah,
you disarm it.
Yeah.
And
God forbid your brand.
Successful campaign.
Yeah, God forbid your brand has nobody making a joke about it, because then you're in trouble.
That is a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Andy Nairn, this has been absolutely wonderful. Your insights on brief writing are especially welcome. We're going to trumpet that. But let me just say one more time, the book is Go Luck Yourself. Forget what I said about luck. That's my own personal opinion. What Andy has here is a great how-to book to really master your brand, to really own it, to take charge of it, and take advantage of all the assets that you may be forgetting and overlooking. Not to mention the fact that you work for an amazing agency, Lucky Generals, and Henry and I have done some reviews of your work for Amazon. I don't know if you caught those episodes.
I think it
was the Christmas or the holiday ad for with the ballerina.
The dancer.
Right, yeah, great.
Yeah, beautiful ad. So it's been wonderful having you, Andy. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And
thank you.
I guess I should say good luck to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, don't tell me to go luck myself, but thank you very much, both of you. I've really enjoyed it too. It's been fun.
It's been great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye. Good
stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.